Good morning from Ithaca, New York. My name is Lash. I'm the director in the Center for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Social Change at Ithaca College. In addition to that role, I'm also a trainer for A Call to Men, which is a violence prevention organization and a well-respected leader on issues of manhood, male socialization, and the intersections with violence and preventing violence against all girls and women. So first, on behalf of A Call to Men and from a very personal place, I'm hoping that everybody watching is able to access basic needs like food and water and shelter as we navigate the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. I know we've heard it many times, but we really find ourselves in some uncertain times and extreme conditions of caution as we prioritize not only our own safety, but the safety of others around us. All of us have been impacted by the coronavirus, from the loss of family, friends, peers, loved ones, and as well as the financial impact and the financial strains that the coronavirus is having on our economy right now. So I hope that we can find each other in our thoughts and our prayers, and that we can continue to support each other, even in our state of social distancing right now, especially providing support for those who are grieving and who may be alone right now, finding ways to physically distance ourselves, but not necessarily social distance ourselves is really important right now. And also, since the start of 2020, we've seen across the globe, particularly here in the United States, a heightened spike in violence against Asian identifying individuals and groups. And I want to invite us to consider that when we associate this virus with one particular ethnicity or nationality, we're creating fear and anger against other human beings. And we begin to lose focus on the virus itself, which is the actual issue. Okay, so I want to invite us to put that at the forefront of our mind. And across the country, people of color are still continuing to experience violence and are being impacted by COVID-19 at disproportionate rates. So while we've been asked to stay at home, what we're seeing is that violence is still showing up. Violence is still coming out. And the mission of the White Ribbon Campaign and the mission of A Call to Men is critical. And the messages that these organizations have still need to be heard and still need to be felt. So just going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about my own personal impacts of domestic violence and how that hurt has showed up for me, things that I experienced as a young person at a very young age, and how those things have impacted me. My birthday is actually tomorrow. And so I've been doing a lot of reflecting and a lot of, thinking back and a lot of naming to move on to other points that I'll talk about is, addressing that hurt, and then how does that healing come up? So here at Ithaca, New York, at Ithaca College, I started off working in multicultural affairs. We were told that we were going to be restructured. And so for the first time in my life, my new supervisor that I would be reporting to was going to be a man. I mean, ever since I was 16 years old, my first job at a grocery store, I've always had women in supervisor capacities. So I didn't really think too much of it until we were actually working together side by side with each other to create this new center that, was going to keep equity at the heart of the college experience. There was a lot of headbutting with myself and this gentleman who was a faculty member for over 20 years. And our disagreements were extremely heightened, and our approach to the work was different. Anytime that we had a disagreement, it just lingered for a really long time with me, to the point that, I developed some form of insomnia. I had a hard time sleeping. I would have dreams and nightmares about, going back and forth with this new person. And then my blood pressure was extremely high, and was told, I need to get that down as soon as possible. Deep anxiety from this self-induced stress that I was putting on, but didn't really know what was going on because I didn't yet address it. I didn't necessarily know how to address it. So as I began to check in with friends and colleagues, particularly, some of the other trainers at A Call to Men, we've developed some good relationships where I feel like I can reach out and have conversations with those individuals. Those folks begin to ask me deeper questions around my supervisor, and really saying that, maybe this has nothing to do with that individual person, but you need to trace the root of that particular issue. And I had to acknowledge that I was carrying around a lot of baggage that had not been addressed. And that baggage was in the form of hurt, pain, and suffering that I experienced at the hands of men in positions of power over me, or that had been charged with my care or my betterment at some point in my life. And what I also had to address was my own man box. At A Call to Men, we talk about the man box, and the man box is an illustration for this collective socialization into manhood that a lot of us, most of us, are pushed through from birth up. This man box is a set of rules. It's a card. It's a quiz that says you have to be like this, and it's a very rigid notion of being a man that you box yourself into and that you have to live in and exist in. And in addressing my own man box in this particular situation, the man box teaches dominance, and that men should always be in control and exert that dominance over each other. So going back and forth with my supervisor, my boss, he has one idea, I feel like I had to one up that idea. Never really knowing where that was coming from. He would say something in a meeting, I had to say something better. He wore a certain type of suit, my suit had to be better the next day. It was just that dominance going back and forth, and I was running myself ragged, trying to keep up with this race where neither one of us actually win. And then I had to dive a little deeper in understanding that my own hurt and my pain and the trauma that was dealt to me came as a result of men in my life. And I thought back to all the women in my life. So thinking back all the way to, my mother, who is one of my biggest supporters. My mother has never questioned me. My mother has never asked me to be something else. My mother's always trusted me, always nurtured me, always supported me. Most of my teachers, I've never had a man teach other than my coaches. So all of the people in my life, I began to realize in positions of power have always been women. And that had an impact on my relationship and how I interact with women. But then I began to think about, okay, who are the men in my life and how do they show up and how do they impact me? And thinking back to, in particular, my father, and really beginning to look at things from a much more critical lens now that I stand on this side of experience and working with A Call to Men and having a better understanding of how violence shows up and what the man box is. My father struggled with his own man box, and he was never given the space and the opportunity to express himself and fully grow into a healthier notion of manhood. And so what that looked like for him in a very limited range of emotions was resulting to violence in many situations, whether that was violence against my mother, and then watching the physical violence that took place in the household, watching the verbal violence, watching the power and control when it came down to money, when it came down to the car and the freedom, watching those things as a child. And then also the physical violence that my father took out on me, not really knowing how to communicate with me as a child. I won't dive deep into certain examples just because I don't want to reintroduce anybody to trauma. But, on the surface, certain things I can remember is being in third grade and beginning to learn times tables, right? I struggled with math and numbers, and I would later in college, once I found out about testing and different things, I would actually come to find that I had a diagnosable learning disability. And that's a separate conversation as we talk about the intersections of identity and how that impacts violence as well. But I remember learning my times tables and I was struggling. And I remember my father slamming my head against the glass table because I couldn't figure out the problems. Or I remember, really learning that football wasn't for me. You know, I did football because, once again, the man box, I felt like it was something I had to do, but I didn't really have the courage to say I don't actually like this. And I remember I skipped football practice to go see Star Wars Episode 1. And my father came home and was like, "How was practice?" And I was like, "Well, I didn't go. I went to the movies with my friends to see Star Wars." And I remember him, grabbing me and throwing me against the wall. And it was a terrible situation. And so, looking at that from that critical lens and seeing how my father struggled with his own man box and how he was impacted, it doesn't excuse any of that behavior. For me, at this point in my life, it simply explains it, and pushes the need for us to have these conversations about how we're socializing our boys and how we're socializing young men into manhood, and having conversations with other men about our man box and how we have been impacted by these things. Thinking back to the women in my life, what is it that they gave me that I needed to be the best person that I can be? We talk about authentic selfhood at A Call to Men. And what I got from women in my life was the total freedom to be myself, free from consequences. Oftentimes, if we deviate from what the man box lays out for us, be the protector, see women as sexual objects, sex is not intimate. It's always, on the prowl and very transactional. The homophobia and don't be like gay men. All these things that hold that man box together and make it up. If we deviate from that performance and putting that mask on and living up to that, there's a whole host of consequences if we step out of the man box. And I won't put some of those consequences out into the space because some of us may have very well been victimized by those particular consequences, but you can imagine what that looks like. But I never got that from women in my life. I was always okay, however I already was and however I presented myself, for most women in my life. And then this definition of strength, right? Being strong and really unpacking what that is. Interacting with my mother, my two older sisters, my grandmother, my teachers, my supervisors, the definition of strength and being strong was never presented to me as something that's wrapped in muscles or something that takes place in the gym or how big I am. It was always about this inner strength, right? This ability to be in check of my own emotions and to be real and to be upfront, and to be able to express a wide range of emotions. And that very internal sense of self. And so I saw that those messages were disproportionate. And, Angela Davis talks about being radical simply means grasping things at the root. So I had to get to the root of my issues and really figure out, now about to march into my 30s, how did the violence impact me? Right? Because as men, we have this tendency to pack things, store it, compartmentalize it, and never really deal with it. And what we know now is that shows up in many different ways, whether it's how we choose to engage with other men, how our relationships, who we are at work, as well as our own self-care. If we look at the suicide rates for the past 10, 20 years, even just recently, men in particular, and even diving down to the margins of the margin, particularly Black men, are at a higher risk in terms of contemplating and committing suicide, especially as we think about now the stay at home and the shelter in place order. Those conversations have to be at the forefront of our mind, is that how do we reach out to those people that are impacted at the margins of the margins? And so in doing that work, tying it all back and thinking about my role at A Call to Men, we talk about how we limit young men through the man box. The man box is simply, if you look at a box, if you look at a Nike box, right, and say that Nike box, that pair of shoe box is the man box. And you look at how big that box is compared to the room that you may be in, compared to the building that you may be in, compared to the city. And you see how small that box is and how much room you actually have to move in that. It's very damaging to a human, limiting and limiting the growth, limiting the potential of individuals, and saying that the only range of emotions that you are allowed to express is anger. And what we know about anger is that anger is a secondary emotion. We don't feel anger first. Anger is usually is a mask. So,